Good evening, and welcome to our fifth and final session of critical Christian thinking on homosexuality and gay rights. I'd like to begin this evening with a few questions from previous classes and address those. Someone wrote last time, are there any specific verses in the Bible that state that marriage is only between one man and one woman? Well, as far as I'm concerned, there is no passage in the Bible that uses that word only. But as I've said previously, the assumption everywhere in the Bible is that marriage is between males and females, whether it be one man and one woman or one man and multiple women. I think, again, there are biological factors and cultural factors and historical factors. I think that is assumed throughout the Bible. But we need to be very careful about something that is assumed throughout the Bible, assuming that is somehow God's will, or God's plan, or God's design. Because slavery is assumed throughout the Bible. Nowhere is slavery challenged or condemned as being wrong. And yet today we would rightly judge that slavery is not God's will, even though the Bible doesn't condemn it. Likewise, I think you see throughout the Bible a dominance of men, patriarchy. Even if that gets modified somewhat in the New Testament and in the churches, you still have a predominance of men over women. Once again, I think there are biological factors, cultural factors, historical factors that explain that assumption. And therefore, if you are ministering to people who make that assumption, you're going to have to adapt to that. So I do not see it as inconsistent that if we can see that though slavery is assumed, we should not affirm slavery. If the patriarchy is assumed, but we should not assume patriarchy, that just because marriage is between men and women, and that is assumed throughout the Bible, that necessarily excludes that marriage could not be extended to persons of the same sex, whether two men or whether two women. Someone wrote, will you address lesbian concerns or activities in today's world? And I haven't said a lot specifically about lesbianism. I've attempted to use gay or homosexual to include both men and women. But most of the concern in the Bible is about men engaging in certain sexual behaviors with other men. With the exception of one passage that we saw last week in Romans, it never specifically mentions women. I do think, of course, that many of the issues, the ethical issues, are the same, whether you're talking about gay men or lesbians. And quite honestly, I am quite sure that there are some differences of concern between lesbians and gay men, of which I'm simply not competent to address. And so I apologize if it seems that perhaps I've overlooked or perhaps slighted my lesbian sisters. I've been intended to include them in the general concerns, in the general presentation that I've made. Someone asked, well, how would you suggest that we discuss homosexuality with young children that have questions, particularly after hearing or seeing something in the media? And quite honestly, I don't have an answer to that. I don't consider myself competent to address that. I think that's something that experts in the field, in the field of crowd psychology, would need to speak to that. Anything I could say would simply be pure opinion and a risky opinion, I feel. So it's a great question. I am not competent to address or answer that question. If you have differing opinions in the church, how do we come up with a curriculum about this for youth in our congregation or such as Sunday school? And once again, I think that is a very legitimate concern, but it is something that others would have to work out. Again, others who have expertise in certain areas of education that I do not possess. Perhaps I could make some contributions if I were part of such an effort, but answering in just a moment or two from here, I really don't feel comfortable in stating an opinion because, again, it would be merely my opinion. So thanks for those questions. Again, I hope that you'll be thinking of some further questions that we hope to include in our presentation before we conclude this evening. We have one final New Testament passage to consider that I deliberately did not discuss last week, but wish to discuss this week. It once again is found in Paul's letter to the church at Rome, Romans chapter 11, verse 24. And if this were a sermon requiring a title, the title that I would give to this sermon, based upon Romans chapter 11, verse 24, would be God's Unnatural Act. Here is what we read. Paul is writing. He is writing to Gentile Christians in the church at Rome. If you, Gentile Christians, were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, kata phusein, and were grafted contrary to nature, para phusein, into a cultivated olive tree, likening spiritual Israel to a cultivated olive tree. How much more will those who are the natural branches, referring to Jews, be grafted into spiritual Israel? He's talking about what had happened in his ministry, which was new. That Gentiles were accepting the message of Jesus Christ. Gentiles were being included in the church. And Paul looked at the church as a spiritual Israel, and as consisting of both Gentile believers and Jewish believers. But here he uses the term for Gentiles, brought into spiritual Israel, being grafted into this olive tree, as being para phusein, against nature. And hopefully you will recall in Romans chapter 1, Paul characterized certain sexual behaviors between men and certain sexual behaviors between women as being para phusein, against nature. Romans chapter 1, the traditional argument has been, what's wrong with homosexual behaviors, homosexual sex? It's against nature. It's para phusein, so one should not do it. It's morally wrong. What does God do in Romans chapter 11, verse 24, according to Paul, using the exact same term? He does something against nature. God does something unnatural. He includes the Gentiles into the people of God. This again underscores to me that para phusein simply cannot be taken consistently as some kind of moral condemnation. Speaking of behaviors that are simply to be dismissed as sins. Otherwise, God committed a sin, including the Gentiles. God committed this unnatural act. Now, para in Greek can also, in addition to meaning against or contrary, mean beyond or alongside. I did have an undergraduate major in Greek. I do not consider myself to be an expert in Greek, so I am not offering a challenge to the translators of most of the versions of the Bible today when they translate in chapter 1 para phusein as being against nature. But it is interesting to me that that word para can mean alongside or beyond. For instance, a paralegal. Is a paralegal against law or against lawyers? No. Someone who works alongside a lawyer. Someone who does work in addition to what would normally be the case. Paranormal experiences like telekinesis and extrasensory perception, if these take place, are these best understood as being against nature? No, they are perhaps alongside nature or beyond nature. So I simply suggest it would be, for someone with much more expertise than myself, that perhaps it might well be understood, or a better understanding, that when Paul talks about same-sex behaviors in general, that maybe the best way to understand it is not so much it's against nature, it's immoral, it's something that happens in addition or beyond. I don't want to make too much of that. But what it does is call into question easy and dogmatic interpretations of Romans chapter 1, easy and dogmatic interpretations of para phusein as being contrary to nature, against nature, or unnatural in a morally significant sense. Having made that point, I would like to give a brief summary of presentations 1 through 4. what I think we've done and where we've been before speaking to a few additional considerations and hopefully dealing with some questions. I began by saying, first of all, that the question of homosexuality and gay rights is a critical and important issue. And it's not going away anytime soon. If churches have been able to ignore it in the past, they are increasingly unable to ignore it because of the recent Supreme Court decision and questions about the issue of gay marriage and gay marriages within the church and gay marriage by Christian clergy. Secondly, it is an issue that provokes strong feelings and strong beliefs, often in opposition, but sometimes in favor as well. Now, I do not want to dismiss the importance of feelings or emotions. And certainly I do think that beliefs are important. But I think as Christians, and as thoughtful Christians, and as ethically sensitive Christians, there needs to be something more involved than simply strong beliefs and strong feelings. So that brings us thirdly to the importance of critical thinking and loving thinking. And again, I basically characterize critical thinking as evidence-based thinking, reasons-based thinking. So whatever perspective you take about the moral status of homosexuality and what should be done in the church, whatever you believe, what are your reasons for believing that? What is your evidence for holding that your beliefs are true? Secondly, critical thinking is logically and ethically consistent thinking. I think, again, you have a hard time saying that, well, because marriage is everywhere assumed in the Bible to be between men and women, therefore that's the way it has to be, that's the way it ought to be. Being consistent, then, in rejecting patriarchy. If you were consistent, you'd recognize everywhere patriarchy is assumed in the Bible, that's God's design, that's God's plan, and there are lots of Christian churches who draw that conclusion. And again, I think you'd have difficulty being consistent when it comes to slavery, which is everywhere assumed in the Bible and not condemned in the Bible. And no such verse as thou shalt free the slaves. I think you're going to have problems with consistency in rejecting slavery, which is everywhere assumed, and say, well, that's not God's design, that's not God's plan. If you think that though slavery is assumed in the Bible, it's not God's design plan, if you think that patriarchy is assumed in the Bible, but it's not God's design, it's not God's plan, then it just seems to me that logically and practical consistency says, acknowledging that everywhere in the Bible, marriage is assumed between men and women, that's not necessarily God's design or God's plan. At the least, what I've presented calls that easy assumption and that dogmatic assumption into major question. But we want to engage in loving thinking as well. We are motivated by love. We're not just trying to be philosophers here, and I'm not trying to be just a philosopher. We're motivated by love. Our goal, hopefully, is to conclude the most loving conclusion possible, and therefore to do the most loving things that we can. So this has raised the issue of theological method and authority. And again, I think there are four voices we have to listen to here. I think, in fact, everybody does appeal to four voices, even if they don't acknowledge that they're doing so. Most people are going to look to Scripture as one of those voices, one of those partners in the conversation. Some people think that's all that they're doing. I think that they are mistaken. Because in addition to Scripture, there is tradition. And most often what people think Scripture or the Bible is teaching are actually traditional interpretations of the Bible, not necessarily the correct interpretations. But again, tradition is at best a helpful minister. It is a very bad master. Every act of progress, ethical, spiritual, religious progress, has had to fight against tradition. It is traditional to question tradition. It is traditional to go against tradition. And many of the things that people believe so confidently today at one point were against tradition. and they were changed in opposition to tradition. So we need to approach tradition, we need to approach scriptures in terms of reason, in terms of critical thinking. As I've already expressed, logically and practically consistent thinking, evidence-based thinking, reasons-based thinking. That will help us to address traditional interpretations and see where perhaps they might be in error. Perhaps they might be flawed or incomplete. And then we need to look to experience as well. Yes, I believe critical Christian thinking needs to look to our best science and our best scientific conclusions about human nature and human behavior. I believe that critical Christian thinking needs to look to philosophy and, again, logic and logical consistency. But I think critical Christian thinking also needs to look to spiritual experience and how it just might be that the Spirit of God moving in that still small voice and sometimes that slow, quiet manner might be leading us into further understanding of truth, a more inclusive understanding of what love requires of us and what love calls us to be and to do. Fifthly, we need to be very clear about a significant distinction between homosexual orientation and homosexual behaviors. Almost all parties to the conversation, no matter which point of view you take, how conservative, how liberal you may be, recognize the validity of a distinction between homosexual orientation, people who explain it in terms of nature, nurture, genetics, whatever, are predominantly or exclusively attracted to members of the same sex, that's orientation, and then homosexual behaviors. Absolutely essential. Even Jerry Falwell years ago, who would take a very different perspective than I have taken today, I remember being very clear about distinguishing between homosexual orientation and homosexual behaviors. Absolutely essential, because when you look at the Bible and you find negative comments about certain types of homosexual behaviors. Specifically in Paul's day, pederasty would be one. Culturally widespread, sex between an older man and a younger man, or typically a young boy. Power differential, exploitive, often abusive. He would be very familiar with male prostitutes, homosexual behavior in terms of prostitution, power differential, dominance and submission, exploitation, abuse. He would be familiar with master-slave, sexual relations. And whether that be master is male and the slave is female, or master is male and the slave is male, again, power differential, dominance, exploitation, abuse. He would be familiar, of course, with the practice of armies when they conquered a city, raping the inhabitants of the city. Inhabitants both male and female, as abuse and as humiliation. He's not talking about loving, committed sexual behaviors here. He's talking about violent and abusive sexual behaviors, which were wrong then and are wrong now. They're wrong if committed by two men or two women, and they're wrong if committed by a man upon a woman or a woman upon a man. They're wrong for heterosexuals as well as being wrong for homosexuals. But he is not speaking, the Bible gives no evidence of having an awareness of homosexual orientation, and he is not speaking of the type of sexual behaviors that come in a committed, loving, caring, sacrificial relationship between members of the same sex. So number 6 made that point about ethical versus unethical same-sex behaviors. Yes, of course the Bible, where it condemns homosexual acts, is condemning unethical same-sex acts. But there is no indication whatsoever that Paul had in mind what you and I could recognize as ethical homosexual relations and ethical homosexual behaviors. Then there's this question of natural law reasoning. It is a significant but now minority tradition in moral philosophy. You find it predominantly among Roman Catholic moral philosophers, but also among some Protestants as well. And as I've shared previously, even people who've never heard of natural law theory still tend to reason this way. If something is natural in accordance with nature, in accordance with the purpose, in accordance with the norm, then it's right. If it's unnatural, if it violates what's perceived to be the purpose, if it goes against the norm, then it's morally wrong. I'm not going to repeat that discussion, but there are just simply major problems with natural law ethics. Not the least of which, it is highly unreliable. Natural law ethics has been used to support slavery, has been used to support patriarchy, has been used to condemn marriage relationships between two members of different races, and of course it's been used to condemn relationships between two members of the same gender, of the same sex. So with all due respect to some very great luminaries, present and past, who have been natural law ethical theorists, it is not the major perspective within contemporary ethics, within contemporary philosophy. It is at least questionable and draws into question any conclusions based upon natural law reasoning. And then the past 2 weeks we've been discussing problems and issues with interpretations, or we might say misinterpretations of the text. In my judgment, you simply cannot take the story of Sodom and use that as a condemnation of homosexuality. The sin of Sodom was, well, inhospitality, yes, gross inhospitality, the threat of gang rape. In this case, homosexual gang rape, but the threat of gang rape. We saw that the same basic issue arose in Judges chapter 19 on the part of the men of Gibeah. You simply, in my judgment, cannot take 2 verses from the book of Leviticus, which talk about 2 men having sex, a man lying with a man as with a woman, and which calls them abominations, and take that term to be a moral term, or some kind of timeless moral truth. The context itself evidences that it's not a moral term, and again, practically, consistently, you and I do all sorts of things all the time that are judged to be abominable, unclean, or detestable by the book of Leviticus. I've already referenced Paul, his talk about something being against nature. That nature teaches us certain things, and this is a violation of what nature teaches us. And again, as much as I respect Paul, and as much as I reverence the Scriptures, I've given you reasons why which we simply cannot interpret that Pauline text as has normally been done. If Paul is correct, then there's something unnatural about women having short hair and men having long hair. No one here believes that. If Paul is correct, there would be something unnatural and morally wrong about God, including non-Jews and the people of God. Where would you and I be? We would not be a part of the people of God. So you cannot, I think, consistently hold his statements about something being against nature as being some kind of decisive moral condemnation or argument against the validity of ethical same-sex relations and behaviors. We looked at a couple of words in 1 Corinthians 6:9, malakoi, or arsenokoitai, and reference that there's ambiguities to what those verses mean. It is an assumption or a preference by translators that they have anything to do about homosexuality at all or homosexual behaviors. And again, if they do, and I'm inclined to think at least one of them does, almost surely addressing pederasty, male prostitution, master-slave sex exploitation. So that's where we've been. I'm going to say in conclusion this evening, I think I've been weaving together a case here over the last 4 weeks. I think that I've been weaving together a case for acceptance and affirmation of gay persons in the church, but in our church. I think along with that, I've been weaving a case against any compelling basis or reasons for rejecting homosexuals, or even merely tolerating gay persons in the life of the church or in our church. I'll have to leave it to you whether I've done what I think that I've done, But I truly believe that that's what I've been doing over the past 4 weeks, weaving this case. Now, how does this affect the churches? We've already talked about 4 attitudes that churches can take toward gay persons. One is rejection. I fail to see how rejection of gay persons, a total rejection, no distinction of orientation, behavior, I fail to see how that evidences Christian love. I see that as being unloving. The second is toleration. Well, you don't accept, you don't affirm, but you're not going to reject. Well, homosexual, gay persons could be members. Kind of a don't ask, don't tell type sort of situation. I do think that that can be an expression of love. I don't think it's an expression of unconditional love. I have a hard time seeing that. But I would not accuse someone who says, well, I don't want to be rejecting. I just find that I can only tolerate. And again, I said, all of us have loving relationships with people that we have to tolerate. So I'm not going to call such a person unloving, but I don't see that as being the fullness of Christian love or unconditional love. Acceptance and affirmation, I do see as the best expressions of the unconditional love of God that we have affirmed and tried to practice here at Cypress Creek Christian Church. These are the conclusions that I draw. So there are 4 attitudes, 4 responses, and that's how it affects the church. Some churches are rejecting. Some churches are at best tolerant, though I think it's becoming increasingly difficult for churches to be tolerant. They're having to take a stand because of cultural and societal pressures. Other churches are accepting and other churches are affirming. Of course, it affects churches in terms of gay leadership in the church. For many people, it's one thing to have gay persons as members, and it's another thing to have gay persons as leaders. But I will simply say, not to have gay persons as leaders who are members of the church means somehow you're implying there's something wrong with these people. So there's something wrong with gay persons serving in church leadership. Again, that would be consistent with toleration. I don't see how that's consistent with acceptance or affirmation. Then there's the issue of gay church marriage, not simply gay marriage. You go across the street to the Justice of the Peace and get married, right? That's not a church marriage. And so that's one thing in the minds of many. It's another thing to have marriage in the church done by your ministers. And again, I am speaking for myself. I said at the beginning, I'm saying again now, I'm not speaking for the church, and I'm certainly not deciding for the church. But I fail to see how a congregation that affirms and accepts gay persons then could not affirm gay marriages in the church by the ministers. Maybe I'm missing something. But I would fail to see how that could be the case. Because in saying, well, we'll accept gay persons and maybe even have them in leadership positions, but we won't allow them to be married in the church and we won't allow our minister to marry them. Again, there's an implication. Well, there's more than an implication. There's an expression, there's something wrong here. That shouldn't be done. And I don't know how that's consistent with acceptance and affirmation. And of course, there are issues of religious liberty at the church or the institutional level. And I am very much an advocate of religious liberty. Even religious liberty when your religious beliefs are different from mine. Even religious liberty when I think your religious beliefs might be plain flat wrong. I'm not just for religious liberty for liberal or progressive Christians. I'm for religious liberty for conservative and fundamentalist Christians as well. So I don't want the government telling a church that doesn't want to conduct gay marriages that they have to do so. I don't think that's going to happen. If and when it does happen, I may be hollering as loud as the fundamentalists are about that. So there's the issue of church institutional religious liberty. I do have a suggestion that is not unique to me, but might be a way of handling this. I don't know if our society or culture is capable of doing it or not. But in many societies, you get married twice. There is a civil union or marriage, and then there may or may not be a church marriage. Maybe the time has come for a separation of marriage and state. And our ministers stop acting as I did once, agents of the state. I married someone, I say, and now by the laws invested to me, the authority invested in me by the laws of the state of Texas, and as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, maybe the time has come that if anybody wants to get married, in terms of having a civil union, recognized by the government, with full and equal legal rights, you go across the street to the justice of the peace and you get a civil union. And if you want a religious ceremony, if you want to be married, then you do that in a church that will marry you. No church is going to be forced to conduct marriages. But everyone, not just some people, everyone is going to participate in a civil union that would give you the legal status of traditional marriage. I don't know whether that can happen or not. I do know that there are churches for a number of years now in which ministers have refused to conduct any kind of legal marriage ceremony. Why? Because those ministers have said, if we cannot marry gay persons in the church, we're not going to marry heterosexual persons in the church. You want to get married in the eyes of the state? Go, anybody. Go get married by the justice of the peace. And then if you want a blessing upon that marriage, if you want a religious affirmation of the marriage, then you come to our church and we'll do that whether you're gay or straight. Well, there are many conservatives now who are beginning to say that perhaps that's what we need to happen, so that institutional religious liberty of conservatives who don't want to participate in gay marriage can be respected. They can have that right to do so. Anybody who wishes to have that kind of marriage-type commitment will be recognized by the state in terms of a civil union. And then if your church does affirm gay marriage, then you can go to that congregation and have that spiritual blessing and have the religious marriage. Perhaps that is an alternative that would respect the rights of all concerned. Of course, there are issues of how the issue affects society. I still think that there is more to the issue of homosexuality and gay rights than merely the issue of homosexuality and gay rights. I think that this is something of a symbolic issue of the ongoing struggle between political conservatives and political liberals. And if you are a political conservative, your brand of political or religious correctness says you have to be against gay marriage. And for some people, if you're a liberal, your brand of political correctness and religious correctness says you have to be in favor of gay marriage. So the issue of gay marriage is symbolic of an ongoing struggle in our culture and our society between politically liberal and progressive persons and politically conservative persons. And fueling a lot of the heat is not just the issue of two people of the same sex getting married. It's the whole agenda of the left or the right, the conservatives or the liberals, packing it into this very symbolic issue. Again, I've addressed the issue of church-state and marriage. I think perhaps the best thing here in terms of affecting society is a separation between marriage and state. But let me address the issue of marriage and parenthood as well. Marriage is a cultural and social institution. And a significant and major function of marriage has been the production of offspring and the nurturance of offspring. And it's been kind of interesting to me and sometimes amusing that when certain attorneys general were arguing against gay marriage before the United States Supreme Court, in my judgment, they really couldn't come out and say the real reasons why people are against it. Real reasons being religiously motivated, because religion arguments don't carry over too well in a constitutional setting. Or tradition. Well, tradition doesn't carry over mere tradition. So they've talked about, well, how the state has an interest in the nurturance and protection of children. And therefore the state has an interest in preserving that marriage is between a man and a woman, because only a man and a woman can have children. But as someone, I think, the first evening wrote on a card, gays adopt children. Gay men and gay women adopt children. Gay couples have children. Gay families as they exist today involve two partners and oftentimes one or more children. So if we are concerned about families and we're concerned about children, if we're concerned that they have the best context in which those children can grow and develop in the context of two persons committed to each other and committed to their children, that's actually a conservative argument, which has been offered by conservatives, some conservatives, for gay marriage. If you want to argue that the state's vested interest in affirming heterosexual marriage and disallowing homosexual marriage is this issue of family, then what about the issue of infertile heterosexual couples? Is their marriage any less a marriage because they can't have children? I think not. What about couples who choose not to have children? Several years ago, we were on Jen and I and my two boys, we were on a cruise in the Caribbean. And I was waiting to get into the dining room, and the family was coming all later on, and I saw this woman standing there. She looked familiar. And all of a sudden, I realized that that was Leah Ray Shree. Leah, if you see this on YouTube, I apologize. My first love in middle school. The first girl I ever held hands with, the first girl I ever kissed. I went up and introduced myself. She didn't recognize me. I had to tell her who I was. But I recognized her, and so her husband and she and Jenny and I, we sat together and we talked. We had dinner together. But she very quickly told me that they were childless by choice, which is a good choice. It was right for them. Was their marriage any less a marriage because they had chosen not to have children? Again, I think not. Yes, people marry, and most people have in the background or foreground of their thinking, at some point in time, they will have children. But I think that most people today in our culture, society, marry first for love, not first to produce offspring. When I met Jenny Maddox in a Sunday school class at the Sagamore Hill Baptist Church one summer and noticed her for the first time, I didn't think, I think she'd be a good person to have children with. I said, she's nice looking. I think I'd like to meet her. And as I got to know her better, I think I love her. I think I would like to marry her. I'm not sure when any idea of having children came along. But it was long after we had made the connection. And it was long after we had tied the knot and become married. So I just do not see how the issue of parenthood and child raising is an argument against gay marriage. In fact, I think it's a pretty good argument for gay marriage and for acceptance and affirmation of gay persons in the church. Now, I do want to wrap this up and leave some moments for anything you might want to ask, or a couple other things I want to do finally to wrap up. But again, I am also sensitive to personal religious liberty. Again, religious liberty is not an absolute right. No right is absolute. So there, I think, are going to be some difficult and complex issues about how individuals, not the liberty of institutions, that's one thing, but individuals works out in terms, particularly people who own businesses. So you've probably heard the case of someone who, a gay couple wanted them to bake them a cake for their wedding, and they refused to bake them a cake, and they've been charged with a crime, they're going to have to pay a fine, and all of that. Well, as much as I would disagree with their attitude of separation and somehow they are defiled by baking a cake for a gay couple or delivering it to the ceremony or something like that, I find myself wanting to be sensitive to persons like that and not wanting the law to come down on them with a hammer. I do want people to have maximum religious liberty, but where religious liberty, even of the individual, works to violate the civil rights of another person, that's a problem. It's one thing if your exercise of religious liberty doesn't affect anybody else's rights. It's another thing if your so-called exercise of religious liberty denies the civil rights of someone else. So there are complex issues here. I've done a little bit of work in these areas. I'm not competent to claim any kind of expertise, but those are going to have to be worked out. And there are going to be some difficult questions to answer there. But we don't simply say, okay, we're going to throw up our hands and not do anything because of the difficult questions and difficult issues that lie ahead in the future. There are a number of Supreme Court cases. I have listed them there for you. But let me simply say this, and you can look them up. The first one, Maynard versus Hill, 1888, talks about marriage as being the most important relation in life, having more to do with the morals and civilization of the people than any other institution. And as shocking as it will be to some of you, perhaps, or some who might be listening to this video, there is a conservative case for gay marriage as being a civilizing factor. Marriage has oftentimes been seen as fundamentally being a way to domesticate the male sex drive. And whether you domesticate that male sex drive with a partner of the same sex or the opposite sex, it's domesticating. It's channeling the male sex drive. So there is a conservative case that you don't often hear about. Meyer versus Nebraska in 1923 placed marriage under the 14th Amendment due process clause, protection of rights. Can't be deprived of certain rights, including marriage rights, without due process of law. Obergefell versus Hodges invoked that 14th Amendment in their decision, I think, as well. But Griswold versus Connecticut and Loving versus Virginia in particular show that in the past the Supreme Court has intervened to secure the rights of individuals against legislatures, against traditions, against people's biblical interpretations. That now you and I would say, well, how could that have ever been an issue? Griswold versus Connecticut says a state cannot make a law outlawing the sale of contraception even to married couples. You want the state of Texas passing a law that you can't buy contraception? It's one way of keeping people from using contraception if it can't be sold legally. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. There was an uproar. They invoked tradition. They invoked natural law. Some of them invoked the Bible. Well, if you're like me, you think that was probably a pretty good decision. Loving versus Virginia, there were laws against people of different races getting married. The Supreme Court said you can't have laws saying that two citizens of the United States of America, just because they happen to be of other races, can't marry. I agree with that, but that was controversial, and people opposed it, and they opposed it in the name of natural law, and they opposed it in the name of tradition, and they opposed it in the name of their biblical interpretations. And yet I think many of us would say, well, that was the right decision. I would like to think that someday the recent Supreme Court decision will be the same way. But Griswold wasn't seen that way in its day, and Loving versus Virginia wasn't universally seen that way in its day, and so far Obergefell versus Hodges is not seen that way either. So I have a few things to wrap up with, but I would at this point like to kind of open things up, see what questions for clarification perhaps, or further questions you might like to ask, as long as you are willing to accept the answer, perhaps, I don't know, or I don't feel qualified to make a comment on that. But if I think I might know, or if I think I might be qualified to make some kind of informed statement, I'll try to answer your question. So, who has a question? Don't be bashful. Don't be shy. Yes, sir. Larry.
Is there any validity to the premise that a child needs a mother and a father's influence? And can a same-sex marriage provide both influences?
Let me avoid the idea of validity. Is that of some, well, maybe not avoid the term validity. Let me evidence my personal opinion, which may not be, again, politically correct to everyone, but that's okay. I can't help but feel that the traditional male role and traditional female role is important to the nurturance of children. That is most easily exercised typically by a man and by a woman. But an individual who is female can exercise the male role in a relationship. And an individual who is a male can exercise a more feminine or female role in the relationship. I tell my students in the past that this whole issue of feminine and masculine is at least significantly a cultural construct. In some ways, I am much more feminine of a person than my father, a member of the World War II generation. And in some ways, I think my wife is much more masculine of a person than her mother. And we have the freedom now, all of us, to embrace elements that were traditionally masculine, traditionally feminine, and to work out that mix in what seems best for us as an individual and us for a couple. So maybe in some ideal sense, is it easier or, quote, better, male, female? Maybe. And I'm saying maybe, and I may very well be wrong on that. But does that mean that is lacking or absent or even deficient when it's two lesbians or two gay men? I don't think so. So I guess I would have to say in the end, no, I don't think there's an ultimate validity to that. That's my opinion. Somebody else? Boy, that's a good question and a hard one. Thanks a lot, Larry. No, thanks a lot. Somebody else? Answered all the questions, covered all the bases. Well, I've tried. I give my students very detailed syllabi and said, you know, this should answer all the questions, but are there any questions? Typically not. Susan? I'm not sorry.
Listen, you might restate the question too, because I know on the YouTube you can't hear.
I will.
Okay. So the question is, and you said this early on in your first couple of presentations, that your views have changed. So I'm curious, maybe this is not the appropriate place to ask it, but what has made you change your
I think it's appropriate
about these things?
I've changed my views because I was raised in a Baptist tradition that said the Bible is the supreme authority, which means not the opinions of people and not traditions, but the Bible. So the Bible was a basis upon which to criticize tradition. And boy, we Baptists criticize those Roman Catholics for their traditions. And those Methodists and Presbyterians and Lutherans who were still a lot Roman Catholic-ish, we criticize them too. We weren't terribly self-critical sometimes. But the idea that tradition can and should be questioned. At some point I realized that the view of the Bible I had been raised in and the interpretations of the Bible that I had learned themselves were traditional. And that the message of the Bible might be different from the interpretations of the Bible and the traditions about the Bible. And so I began to think, well, then what does the Bible really say, really teach? And I needed to understand the historical and cultural context. I needed to learn something about the textual context. I needed to learn something about the meaning of the Hebrew words and the Greek words. And I began to see that sometimes you had to take the Bible against traditions about the Bible. And at some point I began to realize, well, if you're criticizing traditional interpretations of the Bible and you're criticizing traditions, in part I'm using reason. I'm not just quoting chapter and verse. I'm using reason. I'm looking for consistency. I'm looking for evidence. I'm looking for reasons. And so once you embrace reason, that's going to challenge both traditions about the Bible and sometimes even the Bible itself. And it's certainly going to challenge tradition. But then I realized we're not just rational beings. Religion is not just a matter of beliefs. It's not just a matter of the intellect. It's a matter of the heart. It's a matter of religious experience. And at some point, religious experience enters in as well. Well, it's always been there. It's always been a part of what's going on. So you need to acknowledge it. You have to take into account feelings and emotions and religious experience. That's why I say you have to have this quadrilectic. You have to have all these voices in a conversation, challenging one another, and hopefully out of that hubbub, something that you think is probably more like truth emerges. That was a long process. It was not an easy process. It was not a comfortable process. But it's the process I've been through. And that's the process that have led me. I'm a naturally conservative person. I'm going to go with what brung me till I see that what brung me is not that good. The new, to me, has the burden of proof. But sometimes the new fulfills that burden of proof. And the traditional does not. And just in my own judgment, traditional interpretations, traditional responses to the issue of homosexuality, homosexuals in the church, have not stood the burden of proof. They've not made their case in my judgment. The newer, more progressive attitudes, in my judgment, have borne, sustained, and exceeded the burden of proof. They are, for me, more reasonable. They are, for me, more spiritual. I still could be wrong. I'm a fallible human being. But that's where I've been, and that's how I've come to the point where I am now. I would like to conclude by pointing out one thing and then reading one thing in conclusion. I have taken some excerpts from Marcus Borg's book, Jesus, A New Vision. I would encourage you to read that sometime soon. He contrasts purity and compassion. He contrasts an ethics of purity and an ethics of compassion or love. He contrasts the Judaism of his day, concerned with purity and an ethics of purity and an ethics of separation, with Jesus' ethics of love, of compassion, of engagement and inclusion. If that contrast is valid, and I think that it is, I think that Jesus' ethics of love or compassion and of inclusion is supportive of the stance that I've taken. I know it's easy to invoke Jesus to support what you want to believe, okay? But I do think if that is valid, I think this is more consistent with Jesus' ethics of compassion, of acceptance, of inclusion, which scandalized the religious people of his day, by the way. He hangs around with prostitutes, tax gatherers, and sinners. He doesn't separate himself. So I would encourage you to read that. And somehow I ran across on our computer something I wrote back in December of 2011. I think we were doing some kind of epiphany readings, and I'd been asked to write one about love being bigger. I'm not exactly for sure, but there was another one that Jenny had written right next to it that followed the next week. And I would like to conclude by reading that because I think it's very relevant to what we've been talking about. Of course, it quotes John chapter 4, 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God, for God is love. Abraham Lincoln's close friend, H.C. Deming, recounted Lincoln's answer as to why he never joined a church, which is true. Doesn't mean he wasn't religious, doesn't mean he wasn't spiritual, but he didn't join church, he wasn't a member of the church. Now, again, you've got to be careful about this sort of thing, but this seems to be pretty reliable historically. And according to Deming, this was Lincoln's view. I've never united myself to any church because I found difficulty in giving my assent without mental reservation to the long, complicated statements of Christian doctrine which characterize their articles of belief and confession of faith. Well, I guarantee you Lincoln's not the only one about that. When any church will inscribe over its altar as its sole qualification for membership the Lord's condensed statement of the substance of both law and gospel, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself, that church will I join with all my heart and soul. I went on to write that I would like to think that Lincoln would have united himself at Cypress Creek Christian Church. The reason I am a member of this church, and the reason this church means so much to me, is that we affirm and we endeavor to live out the unconditional love of God revealed in Jesus Christ. Cypress Creek is bigger than we think because love is bigger than we think. Because God is bigger than we think. And God is love. Many people make God too small because they conceive of God and the love of God in limited, imperfect terms. If God's love truly is bigger than we think, then it's out without limit and without imperfection. If Cypress Creek is truly bigger than we think, that bigness is an ever-growing love, a limitations-overcoming love, an imperfection surmounting love within and among us. Love for God, love for one another, love for our community, and love for our world. I would like to think that the bigness of Cypress Creek Christian Church, again, this is my personal point of view, is big enough to affirm and to accept full affirmation and full acceptance my gay brothers and my gay sisters. And with that, we conclude our discussions, presentations, and thank you for being here this evening. Glad I did. Glad it's over.
I'm glad